Good morning. My name is Clottie Hammonds, and I want to welcome everybody to the 25th annual Emancipation Marathon. And we are at Changing Hands Bookstore today, and you're welcome to come down if you choose, but we will be streaming throughout the day.
What to the slave is the 4th of July? A speech given by Frederick Douglass on July 5th, 1852, to the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society of Rochester, New York. Mr. President and friends and fellow citizens, he who could address this audience without a quailing sensation has stronger nerves than I have. I do not remember ever to have appeared as a speaker before an assembly more strikingly, nor with greater trust of my ability than I do this day. A feeling has crept over me, quite unfavorable before me is one which requires much previous thought and study for its proper performance. I know that apologies. Oh, sorry. Was I on? Was I should? I should. So I have to use that mic.
No, we were just wondering if you wanted to.
No, but was it picking me? I don't. I don't know if I. Sister,
can't really hear.
I need somebody to help me. Okay. When they came, was I on? Or,
Yeah, you're on right now.
but when they came over doing the mic, I thought I wasn't on.
Oh, that's okay. Don't worry about it.
May I start over?
Yes, you may.
Okay, yeah, I don't need. Well,
Okay, perfect. We just wanted to make sure. No, it's okay. So it's here.
Oh.
If you need it.
All right, forgive me for that. I will start over again. Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens, he who could address this audience without a quailing sensation has stronger nerves than I. I do not remember ever to have prepared as a speaker before an assembly more strikingly, nor with greater distrust of my ability than I do this day. A feeling has crept over me quite unfavorable to the exercise of my limited powers of speech. The task before me is one which requires much previous thought and study for its proper performance. I know that apologies of this sort are generally considered flat and unmeaning. I trust, however, that mine will not be so considered. Should I seem at ease, my appearance would much misrepresent me. The little experience I have in addressing public meetings in country schoolhouses avails me nothing on this present occasion. The papers and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. This certainly sounds large and out of the common way for me. It is true that I have often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who now honor me with their presence. But neither their familiar faces nor the perfect gauge I think I have of Corinthian Hall seems to free me from embarrassment. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the difficulties to become overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. that I am here today is to me a matter of astonishment as well as of gratitude. You will not therefore be surprised if in what I have to say, I evince no elaborate preparation, nor grace my speech with any high-sounding exordium. With little experience and with less learning, I have been able to throw my thoughts hastily and imperfectly together, and trusting to your patient and generous indulgence, I will proceed to lay them before you. This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This to you is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your deliverance and to the signs and to the wonders associated with that act and that day. This celebration also marks the beginning of your nation, that your nation is so young. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. 76 years, though a good old age for a man, is but a mere speck in the life of a nation. 70 is the allotted time for individual men, but nations number their years by thousands. According to this fact, you are, even now, only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower your horizon. The eye of the reformer is met with angry flashes, portending disastrous times, but his heart may well beat lighter at the thought that America is young and that she is still in the impressionable stage of her existence. May he not hope that high lessons of wisdom, of justice, and of truth will yet give direction to her destiny. Were the nation older, the patriot's heart might be sadder, and the reformer's brow heavier. Its future might be shrouded, and the hope of its prophets go out in sorrow. There is consolation in the thought that America is young. Great streams are not easily turned from channels worn deep in the course of the ages. They may sometimes rise in quiet and stately majesty and inundate the land, refreshing and fertilizing the earth with their mysterious properties. They may also rise in wrath and fury and bear away on their angry waves the accumulated wealth of years of toil and hardship. They, however, gradually flow back to the same old channel and flow on as serenely as ever. But while the river may not be turned aside, it may dry up and leave nothing behind but the withered branch and the unsightly rock to howl in the abyss sweeping wind and the sad tale of a departed glory. As with rivers, so with nations. Fellow citizens, I should not presume to dwell at length on this associations with that cluster about this day. The simple story of it is that 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects. The style and title of your sovereign people, in which you now glory, was not then born. You were under the British crown. Your fathers esteemed the English government as the home government and England as the fatherland. This home government, you know, although a considerable distance from your home, did in the exercise of its parental prerogatives impose upon its colonial children such restraints, burdens, and limitations as in the mature judgment it deemed wise, right, and proper. But your fathers, who had not adopted the fashionable idea of this day of the infallibility of the government and the absolute character of its acts, presumed to differ from the home government in respect to the wisdom and the justice of some of those burdens and restraints. They went so far in their excitement as to pronounce the measures of government unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive, and altogether such as ought not to be quietly submitted to. I scarcely need say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Such a declaration of agreement on my part would not be worth much to anybody. It would certainly prove nothing as to what part I might have taken had I lived during the great controversy of 1776. To say now that America was right and England wrong is exceedingly easy. Everybody can say it. The dastard, not less than the noble brave, can flippantly descant on the tyranny of England towards the American colonies. It is fashionable to do so, but there was a time when to pronounce against England and its favor of the cause of the colonies tried men's souls. They who did so were accounted in their day plotters of mischief, agitators and rebels, dangerous men. To side with the right against the wrong, with the weak against the strong, and with the oppressed against the oppressor, here lies the merit, and the one which of all others seems unfashionable to our day. The cause of liberty may be stabbed by the men who glory in the deeds of your fathers. But to proceed, feeling themselves harshly and unjustly treated by the home, your fathers, like men of honesty and men of spirit, earnestly sought redress. They petitioned and remonstrated. They did so in a decorous, respectful, and loyal manner. Their conduct was wholly unexceptionable. This, however, did not answer the purpose. They saw themselves treated with sovereign indifference, coldness, and scorn, yet they persevered. They were not the men to look back. As a sheet anchor takes a firmer hold, when the ship is tossed by the storm, so did the cause of your fathers grow stronger as it breasted the chilling blast of kingly displeasure. But with that blindness, the greatest and best of British statesmen admitted its justice, and the loftiest eloquence of the British Senate came to its support. But with that blindness, which seems to be the unwavering, varying characteristic of tyrants, since Pharaoh and his hosts were drowned in the Red Sea, the British government persisted in the exactions complained of. The madness of this course, we believe, is admitted now, even by England. But we fear the lesson is wholly lost on our present rulers. Oppression makes the wise man mad. Your fathers were wise men, and if they did not go mad, they became restive under the treatment. They felt themselves the victims of grievous wrongs, wholly incurable in their colonial capacity. With brave men, there is always a remedy for oppression. Just here, the idea of the total separation of the colonies from the crown was born. It was a startling idea, much more so than we at this distance of time regard it. The timid and the prudent, as has been intimated of that day, were, of course, shocked and alarmed by it. Such people lived then, had lived before, and will probably ever have a place on this planet. And their course in respect to any great change, no matter how great the good to be obtained or the wrong to be redressed by it, may be calculated with as much precision as can be the course of the stars. They hate all changes, but silver, gold, and copper change. Of this sort of change, they are always strongly in favor. These people were called Tories in the days of your fathers, and the appellation probably conveyed the same idea that is meant by a more modern, though a somewhat less euphonious term, which we often find in our papers, applied to some of our old politicians. Their opposition to the then dangerous thought was earnest and powerful, but amid all their terror and affrighted vociferations against it, the alarming and revolutionary idea moved on, and the country with it. On the 2nd of July, 1776, the old Continental Congress, to the dismay of the lovers of ease and the worshipers of property, clothed that dreadful idea with all the authority of national sanction. They did so in the form of a resolution, and as we seldom hit upon resolutions drawn up in our day, whose transparency is at all equal to this, it may refresh your minds and help my story if I read it. Resolve that the United Colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be dissolved. Citizens, your fathers made good that resolution. They succeeded, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history. The very ring bolt in the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny. Pride and patriotism, not less than gratitude, prompt you to celebrate and to hold it in perpetual remembrance. I have said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt of the chain of your nation's destiny. So indeed I regard it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, and at whatever cost. From the round top of your ship of state, dark and threatening clouds may be seen. Heavy billows like mountains in the distance disclose to the leeward huge forms of flinty rocks. The bolt drawn, the chain broken, and all is lost. Cling to this day, cling to it, and to its principles with the grasp of a storm-tossed mariner to spar at midnight. The coming into being of a nation in many circumstances is an interesting event, but besides general consideration, there were peculiar circumstances which make the advent of this republic an event of special attractiveness. The whole scene, as I look back to it, was simple, dignified, and sublime. The population of the country at the time stood at the insignificant number of 3 millions. The country was poor in the munitions of war. The population was weak and scattered, and the country a wilderness unsubdued. There were then no means of concert and combination such as exists now. Neither stream nor lightning had been reduced to order and discipline. From the Potomac to the Delaware was a journey of many days. Under these and innumerable other disadvantages, your fathers declared for liberty and independence and triumph. Fellow citizens, I'm not wanting to in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. They loved their country better than their own private interests. And though this is not the highest form of human excellence, all which concede that it is a rare virtue and that when it is exhibited, it ought to command respect. He who will intelligently lay down his life for his country is a man whom is not in human nature to despise. Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country. In their admiration of liberty, they lost sight of all other interests. They were peace men, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but that they knew its limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out the more as we contrast it to these degenerate times. How circumspect, exact, and proportionate were all of their movements. How unlike the politicians of an hour. Their statesmanship looked beyond the passing moment and stretched away in strength into the distant future. They seized upon eternal principles and set a glorious example in their defense. Mark them. Fully appreciating the hardship to be encountered, firmly believing in the right of their cause, honorably inviting the scrutiny of an onlooking world, reverently appealing to heaven to attest their sincerity, soundly comprehending the solemn responsibility they were about to assume, wisely measuring the terrible odds against them. Your fathers, the fathers of this republic, did most deliberately, under the inspiration of a glorious patriotism and with a sublime faith in the great principles of justice and freedom, lay deep the cornerstone of the national superstructure, which has risen and still rises in grandeur around you. Of this fundamental work, this day is the anniversary. Our eyes are met with demonstrations of joyous enthusiasm. Banners and pennants were exultantly on the breeze. The din of business too is hushed. Even Mammon seemed to have quitted his grasp on this day. The ear-piercing fife and the stirring drum unite their accents with the ascending peal of 1,000 church bells. Prayers are made, hymns are sung, and sermons are preached in the honor of this day, while the quick martial tramp of a great and multitudinous nation, echoed back by all the hills, valleys, and mountains of a vast continent, bespeak the occasion, one of thrilling and universal interest, a nation's jubilee. Friends and citizens, I need not enter further into the causes which led to this anniversary. Many of you understand them better than I do. You could instruct me in regard to them. That is a branch of knowledge in which you feel perhaps a much deeper interest than your speaker. The Causes which led to the separation of the colonies from the British crown have never lacked for a tongue. They have all been taught in your common schools, narrated at your firesides, unfolded from your pulpits, and thundered from your legislative halls, and are as familiar to you as household words. They form the staple of your national poetry and eloquence. I remember also that as a people, Americans are remarkably familiar with all facts which make in their own favor. This is esteemed by some as a national trait, perhaps a national weakness. It is a fact that whatever makes for your wealth or for the reputation of Americans and can be had cheap will be found by Americans. I shall not be charged with slandering Americans if I say I think the American side of any question may be safely left in American hands. I leave, therefore, the great deeds of your fathers to other gentlemen whose claim to have been regularly descended will be less likely to be disputed than mine. The present. My business, if I have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and his cause is the ever-living now. Trust no future, however pleasant. Lead the dead past, bury its dead. Let the dead past, bury its dead. Act in the living present. Heart within and God overhead. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future, to all inspiring motives, to noble deeds which can be gained from the past. We are welcome. But now is the time, the important time. Your fathers have lived, died, and have done their work and have done much of it well. You live and must die, and you must do work. You have no right to enjoy the child's share in the labor of your fathers unless your children are to be blessed by your labors. You have no right to wear out and waste the hard-earned fame of your fathers to cover your indolence. Sidney Smith tells us that men seldom eulogize the wisdom and virtues of their fathers, but to excuse some folly or wickedness of their own. The truth is not a doubtful one. There are illustrations of it near and remote, ancient and modern. It was fashionable hundreds of years ago for the children of Jacob to boast, "We have Abraham to our father," when they had long lost Abraham's faith and spirit. That people contented themselves under the shadow of Abraham's great name, while they repudiated the deeds which made him great. Need I remind you that a familiar thing is being done all over this country today? Need I tell you that the Jews are not the only people who built the tombs of the prophets and garnished the sepulchres of the righteous? Washington could not die till he had broken the chains of his slaves. Yet his monument is built up by the price of human blood and the traitors in the bodies and souls of men. They shout, "We have Washington as our father." Alas, that it should be so, yet so it is. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light and my burden easy and delightful. For who is there so cold that a nation's sympathy could not warm him? Who so obdurate and dead to the claims of gratitude that would not thankfully acknowledge such priceless benefits? Who so stolid and selfish that would not give his voice to swell the hallelujahs of a nation's jubilee when the chains of servitude had been torn from his limbs? I am not that man. In a case like that, the dumb might eloquently speak and the lame man leap as a hart. But such is not the state of the case. I say it with a sad sense of disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct. And let me warn you that it is dangerous to copy the example of a nation whose crimes, towering up to heaven, were thrown down by the breath of the Almighty, bearing the nation in irrecoverable ruin. I can today take up the plaintive lament of a peeled and woe-smitten people. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof, for there they that carried us away captive required of us a song. And they who wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains heavy and grievous yesterday are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not faithfully remember those bleeding children of sorrow this day, may my right hand forget her cunning, may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. To forget them, to pass lightly over their wrongs, and to chime in with the popular theme would be treason, most scandalous and shocking, and would make me a reproach before God and the world. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view, standing there identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine. I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce with all the emphasis I can command everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me, that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice, or who is not at heart a slaveholder, shall not confess to be right and just. But I fancy to hear some of you of my audience say, it is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed. But I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me to argue? On what branch of the subject do the people of this country need light? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? That point is conceded already. Nobody doubts it. The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of laws for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he be, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject the white man to the like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? The manhood of the slave is conceded. It is admitted in the fact that Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read or to write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beast of the fields, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. When the dogs in your streets, when the fowls of the air, when the cattle on your hills, when the fish of the sea and the reptiles that crawl shall be unable to distinguish the slave from a brute, then I will argue with you that the slave is a man. For the present, it is enough to affirm the equal manhood of the Negro race. It is not astonishing that while we are plowing, planting, and reaping, using all kinds of mechanical tools, erecting houses, constructing bridges, building ships, working in metals of brass, iron, copper, silver, and gold, that while we are reading, writing, and ciphering, acting clerks, merchants, and secretaries, having among us lawyers, doctors, ministers, poets, authors, editors, orators, and teachers, that while we are engaged in all manner of enterprises common to other men, digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding sheep and cattle on the hillside, living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living in families as husbands, wives, and children, and above all, confessing and worshiping the Christian's God, and look hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave, we are called upon to prove that we are men. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is that a question for Republicans? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation as a matter beset with great difficulty? involving a doubtful application of the principle of justice, hard to be understood? How should I look today in the presence of Americans dividing and subdividing a discourse to show that men have a natural right to freedom? To do so would be to make myself ridiculous and to offer an insult to your understanding. There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him, speaking of it relatively and positively, negatively. What I am to argue? What am I to argue? That it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them like dogs, to sell them at an auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters. Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employments for my time and strength than such arguments would imply. What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine, that God did not establish it, that our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There is blasphemy in the thought. That which is inhuman cannot be divine. Who can reason on such a proposition? They that can may, I cannot. The time of such argument is past. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and I could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes that would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last Lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival.
I'm Kari Carlisle. We're in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm reading from The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. When from 2014 to 2016, riots in places like Ferguson, Baltimore, Milwaukee, or Charlotte captured our attention, most of us thought we knew how these segregated neighborhoods with their crime, violence, anger, and poverty came to be. We said they are de facto segregated, that they result from private practices, not from law or government policy. De facto segregation, we tell ourselves, has various causes. When African Americans moved into a neighborhood like Ferguson, a few racially prejudiced white families decided to leave, and then as the number of Black families grew, the neighborhood deteriorated and white flight followed. Real estate agents steered whites away from Black neighborhoods and Blacks away from white ones. Banks discriminated with redlining, refusing to give mortgages to African Americans or extracting unusually severe terms from them with subprime loans. African Americans haven't generally gotten the educations that would enable them to earn sufficient incomes to live in white neighborhoods, and as a result, many remain concentrated in urban neighborhoods. Besides, Black families prefer to live with one another. All this has some truth, but it remains a small part of the truth, submerged by a far more important one. Until the last quarter of the 20th century, racially explicit policies of federal, state, and local governments defined where whites and African Americans should live. Today's residential segregation in the North, South, Midwest, and West is not the unintended consequence of individual choices and of otherwise well-meaning law or regulation, but of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every metropolitan area of the United States. The policy was so systematic and forceful that its effects endure to the present time. Without our government's purposeful imposition of racial segregation, the other causes, private prejudice, white flight, real estate steering, bank redlining, income differences, and self-segregation, still would have existed, but with far less opportunity for expression. Segregation by intentional government action is not de facto. Rather, it is what courts call de jure, segregation by law and public policy. Residential racial segregation by state action is a violation of our Constitution and its Bill of Rights. The Fifth Amendment, written by our founding fathers, prohibits the federal government from treating citizens unfairly. The 13th Amendment, adopted immediately after the Civil War, prohibits slavery or in general treating African Americans as second-class citizens, while the 14th Amendment, also adopted after the Civil War, prohibits states or their local governments from treating people either unfairly or unequally. The applicability of the 5th and 14th Amendments to government sponsorship of residential segregation will make sense to most readers. Clearly, denying African Americans access to housing subsidies that were extended to whites constitutes unfair treatment, and if consistent, rises to the level of a serious constitutional violation. But it may be surprising that residential segregation also violates the 13th Amendment. We typically think of the 13th as only abolishing slavery. Section 1 of the 13th Amendment does so, and Section 2 empowers Congress to enforce Section 1. In 1866, Congress enforced the abolition of slavery by passing a Civil Rights Act, prohibiting actions that it deemed perpetuated the characteristics of slavery. Actions that made African Americans second-class citizens, such as racial discrimination in housing, were included in the ban. In 1883, though, the Supreme Court rejected this congressional interpretation of its powers to enforce the 13th Amendment. The court agreed that Section 2 authorized Congress to pass all laws necessary and proper for abolishing all badges and incidents of slavery in the United States. But it did not agree that exclusions from housing markets could be a badge or incident of slavery. In consequence, these Civil Rights Act protections were ignored for the next century. Today, however, most Americans understand that prejudice toward and mistreatment of African Americans did not develop out of thin air. The stereotypes and attitudes that support racial discrimination have their roots in the system of slavery upon which the nation was founded. So to most of us, it should now seem reasonable to agree that Congress was correct when it determined that prohibiting African Americans from buying or renting decent housing perpetuated second-class citizenship that was a relic of slavery. It also now seems reasonable to understand that if government actively promoted housing segregation, it failed to abide by the 13th Amendment's prohibition of slavery and its relics. This interpretation is not far-fetched. Indeed, it is similar to one that was eventually adopted by the Supreme Court in 1968 when it effectively rejected its 1883 decision. In 1965, Joseph Lee Jones and his wife Barbara Jo Jones sued the Alfred H. Mayer Company, a St. Louis developer, who refused to sell them a home solely because Mr. Jones was Black. 3 years later, the Supreme Court upheld the Joneses' claim and recognized the validity of the 1866 Civil Rights Act's declaration that housing discrimination was a residue of slave status that the 13th Amendment empowered Congress to eliminate. Yet because of an historic accident, policymakers, the public, and even civil rights advocates have failed to pay much attention to the implications of the Jones v. Mayer decision. 2 months before the Supreme Court announced its ruling, Congress adopted the Fair Housing Act, which was then signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Although the 1866 law had already determined that housing discrimination was unconstitutional, it gave the government no powers of enforcement. The Fair Housing Act provided for modest enforcement, and civil rights groups have used this law, rather than the earlier statute, to challenge housing discrimination. But when they did so, we lost sight of the fact that housing discrimination did not become unlawful in 1968. It had been so since 1866. Indeed, throughout those 102 years, housing discrimination was not only unlawful, but it was the imposition of a badge of slavery that the Constitution mandates us to remove. The color of law is concerned with consistent government policy that was employed in the mid-20th century to enforce residential racial segregation. There were many specific government actions that prevented African Americans and whites from living among one another, and I categorize them as unconstitutional. In doing so, I reject the widespread view that an action is not unconstitutional until the Supreme Court says so. Few Americans think that racial segregation in schools was constitutional before 1954, when the Supreme Court prohibited it. Rather, segregation was always unconstitutional, although a misguided Supreme Court majority mistakenly failed to recognize this. Yet, even if we came to a nationally shared recognition that government policy has created an unconstitutional de jure system of residential segregation, it does not follow that litigation can remedy this situation. Although most African Americans have suffered under this de jure system, they cannot identify with the specificity a court case requires the particular point at which they were victimized. For example, many African American World War II veterans did not apply for government guaranteed mortgages for suburban purchases because they knew that the Veterans Administration would reject them on account of their race, so applications were pointless. Those veterans then did not gain wealth from home equity appreciation as did white veterans, and their descendants could then not inherit that wealth as did white veterans' descendants. With less inherited wealth, African Americans today are generally less able than their white peers to afford to attend good colleges. If one of those African American descendants now learned that the reason his or her grandparents were forced to rent apartments in overcrowded urban areas was that the federal government unconstitutionally and unlawfully prohibited banks from lending to African Americans, the grandchild would not have the standing to file a lawsuit, nor would he or she be able to name a particular party from whom damages could be recovered. There is generally no judicial remedy for a policy that the Supreme Court wrongheadedly approved. But this does not mean that there is no constitutionally required remedy for such violations. It is up to the people, through our elected representatives, to enforce our Constitution by implementing the remedy. By failing to recognize that we now live with the severe, enduring effects of a de jure segregation, we avoid confronting our constitutional obligation to reverse it. If I am right that we continue to have de jure segregation, then desegregation is not just a desirable policy, it is a constitutional as well as a moral obligation that we are required to fulfill. Let bygones be bygones is not a legitimate approach if we wish to call ourselves a constitutional democracy. Racial segregation in housing was not merely a project of Southerners in the former slaveholding Confederacy. It was a nationwide project of the federal government in the 20th century, designed and implemented by its most liberal leaders. Our system of official segregation was not the result of a single law that consigned African Americans to designated neighborhoods. Rather, scores of racially explicit laws, regulations, and government practices combined to create a nationwide system of urban ghettos surrounded by white suburbs. Private discrimination also played a role, but it would have been considerably less effective had it not been embraced and reinforced by government. Half a century ago, the truth of de jure segregation was well known, but since then, we have suppressed our historical memory and soothed ourselves into believing that it all happened by accident or by misguided private prejudice. Popularized by Supreme Court majorities from the 1970s to the present, the de facto segregation myth has now been adopted by conventional opinion, liberal and conservative alike. A turning point came when civil rights groups sued to desegregate Detroit's public schools. Recognizing that you couldn't desegregate schools if there were few white children in Detroit, the plaintiffs argued that a remedy had to include the white suburbs as well as the heavy African American city. In 1974, by a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court disagreed. The majority reasoned that because government policy in the suburbs had not segregated Detroit schools, the suburbs couldn't be included in a remedy. Justice Potter Stewart explained that the Black students were concentrated in the city, not spread throughout Detroit suburbs because of unknown and perhaps unknowable factors such as in-migration, birth rates, economic changes, or cumulative acts of private racial fears. He concluded the Constitution simply does not allow federal courts to attempt to change that situation unless and until it is shown that the state, by its political subdivisions, have contributed to cause the situation to exist. No record has been made in this case showing that the racial composition of the Detroit school population or that residential patterns within Detroit and in the surrounding areas were in any significant measure caused by government activity. Most disturbing about Justice Stewart's observation was that the civil rights plaintiffs did offer evidence to prove that residential patterns within Detroit and in the surrounding areas were in significant measure caused by governmental activity. Although the trial judge agreed with this argument, Justice Stewart and his colleagues chose to ignore it, denying that such evidence even existed. This misrepresentation of our racial history, indeed this willful blindness, became the consensus view of the American jurisprudence, expressed again in a decision written by Chief Justice John Roberts in 2007. His opinion prohibited school districts in Louisville and Seattle from accounting for a student's race as part of modest school integration plans. Each district permitted students to choose which school they would attend, but if remaining seats in a school were limited, the district admitted students who would contribute to the school's racial balance. In other words, Black students would get preference for admission to mostly white schools, and white students would get preference for mostly Black ones. The Chief Justice noted that racially homogeneous housing arrangements in these cities had led to racially homogeneous student bodies in neighborhood schools. He observed that racially separate neighborhoods might result from societal discrimination, but said that remedying discrimination not traceable to government's own actions can never justify a constitutionally acceptable, racially conscious remedy. The distinction between segregation by state action and racial imbalance caused by other factors has been central to our jurisprudence. Where racial imbalance is a product not of state action but of private choices, it does not have constitutional implications. Because neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle had been segregated by private choices, he concluded, school districts should be prohibited from taking purposeful action to reverse their own resulting segregation. Chief Justice Roberts himself was quoting from a 1992 opinion by Justice Anthony Kennedy in a case involving school segregation in Georgia. In that opinion, Justice Kennedy wrote, "Vestiges of past segregation by state decree do remain in our society and in our schools. Past wrongs to the Black race, wrongs committed by the state and in its name, are a stubborn fact of history. And stubborn facts of history linger and persist. But though we cannot escape our history, neither must we overstate its consequences in fixing legal responsibilities. The vestiges of segregation may be subtle and intangible, but nonetheless, they must be so real that they have a causal link to the de jure violation being remedied. It is certainly not always the case that demographic forces causing a population change bear any real and substantial relation to a de jure violation." The following pages will refute this too comfortable notion expressed by Justice Kennedy and endorsed by Chief Justice Roberts and his colleagues, that wrongs committed by the state have little causal link to the residential segregation we see around us. The color of law demonstrates that racially explicit government policies to segregate our metropolitan areas are not vestiges, were neither subtle nor intangible, and were sufficiently controlling to construct the de jure segregation that is now with us in neighborhoods and hence in schools. The core argument of this book is that African Americans were unconstitutionally denied the means and rights to integration in middle-class neighborhoods, and because this denial was state-sponsored, the nation is obligated to remedy it. Many legal scholars are properly skeptical of the distinction between de jure and de facto segregation. Where private discrimination is pervasive, they argue, discrimination by public policy is indistinguishable from societal discrimination. For example, it becomes a community norm for whites to flee a neighborhood where African Americans were settling. This norm can be as powerful as if it were written into law. Both public policy discrimination and societal discrimination express what these scholars term structural racism, in which many, if not most, institutions in the country operate to the disadvantage of African Americans. It is pointless, these scholars argue, to try to distinguish the extent to which these institutions' racially disparate impact originated with private or public discrimination. Government has an obligation, they say, to remedy structural racism regardless of its cause decades ago. These scholars may be right, but in this book, I don't take their approach. Rather, I adopt the narrow legal theory of Chief Justice Roberts, his predecessors, his colleagues, and their likely successors. They agree that there is a constitutional obligation to remedy the effects of government-sponsored segregation, though not of private discrimination. I will take them at their word. Where the color of law differs is not with their theory, but with their facts. For those who, like the court, believe that the Constitution requires a remedy for government-sponsored segregation, but that most segregation doesn't fall into this category, I hope to show that Justice Roberts and his colleagues have their facts wrong. Most segregation does fall into the category of open and explicit government-sponsored segregation. Before I begin, some notes about word usage. I will frequently refer, indeed I've already done so, to things we have done or things we should do. We means all of us, the American community. This is not a book about whites as actors and blacks as victims. The citizens in this democracy, we, all of us, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, and others, bear a collective responsibility to enforce our Constitution and to rectify past violations whose effects endure. Few of us may be the direct descendants of those who perpetuated a segregated system or those who were its most exploited victims. African Americans cannot await rectification of past wrongs as a gift, and white Americans collectively do not owe it to African Americans to rectify them. We, all of us, owe this to ourselves. As American citizens, whatever routes we or our particular ancestors took to get to this point, we're all in this together now. Over the past few decades, we have developed euphemisms to help us forget how we as a nation have segregated African American citizens. We have become embarrassed about saying ghetto, a word that accurately describes a neighborhood where government has not only concentrated a minority, but established barriers to its exit. We don't hesitate to acknowledge that Jews in Eastern Europe were forced to live in ghettos where opportunity was limited and leaving was difficult or impossible. But when we encounter similar neighborhoods in this country, we now delicately refer to them as the inner city, yet everyone knows what we mean. When affluent whites gentrify the same geographic areas, we don't characterize those whites as inner city families. Before we became ashamed to admit that the country had circumscribed African Americans in ghettos, analysts of race relations, both African American and white, consistently and accurately used ghetto to describe low-income African American neighborhoods created by public policy with a shortage of opportunity and with barriers to exit. No other term succinctly describes this combination of characteristics, so I use the term as well. We've developed other euphemisms too, so that polite company doesn't have to confront our history of racial exclusion. When we consider problems that arise when African Americans are absent in significant numbers from schools that whites attend, we say we seek diversity, not racial integration. When we wish to pretend that the nation did not single out African Americans in a system of segregation specifically aimed at them, we diffuse them as just another people of color. I try to avoid such phrases. Because our majority culture has tended to think of African Americans as inferior, the words we've used to describe them, no matter how dignified they seem when first employed, eventually sound like terms of contempt. African Americans react and insist on new terminology, which we eventually accept until it too seems to connote inferiority. So at the beginning of the 20th century, America's subordinated race was called colored. Today, later, we came to think of it as Negro, first with a lowercase and then with a capital N. It was replaced by Black, a term that has had a seemingly permanent currency. Today, African American strikes us as most appropriate. In these pages, it's the term I'll use most frequently, but I will sometimes use Black as well. Occasionally, in describing historical events, I will refer to Negroes, intending the same respect that it enjoyed in those earlier periods. This shifting of terminology should not distract us from this underlying truth. We have created a caste system in this country with African Americans kept exploited and geographically separate by racially explicit government policies. Although most of these policies are now off the books, they have never been remedied and their effects endure.
Hi, my name is Cameron, and I'm going to be reading this article, The Desire for a Reckoning Meets the Wish for a Reset, by Gene Demby. The title of Ta-Nehisi Coates' much-discussed cover story at The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations, might be something of a misnomer. Coates' opus is really calling for a collective reckoning with America's history, and he uses a call for reparations as the vehicle. He aims to disabuse readers of the notion that the most destructive policies toward Black wealth creation were from some long ago time. So he recounts a dark and fairly recent history of Black wealth being plundered. The case for a reckoning. From the kleptocratic local governments of the Jim Crow South to the redlining and housing discrimination of the post-World War II period, Coates points to a pattern that continues into living memory. He traces this pattern to the current day. His conclusion links the recent housing crisis that devastated Black wealth to this same fundamental impulse, and argues that it will persist until we grapple with it. He animates much of that history with the story of Clyde Ross, a 91-year-old World War II vet who lives in Chicago. Ross's father was a sharecropper in Mississippi, and the little material wealth his family could cobble together, their horses, their land, was forcefully seized from them by white officials in their town. After the war, an adult Ross moved to Chicago and was confronted by a new type of predation. The Federal Housing Administration assigned grades to neighborhoods based on their desirability, giving lower grades to neighborhoods with Black people in them. And since the agency refused to extend home loans to Black people or those who lived near them, Ross and people like him were out of legit means to buy homes. Instead, they had to rely on shady speculators. Ross bought his home in North Lawndale, a Chicago neighborhood initially meant to be a model for urban integration, from one such speculator on contract. He paid for his house in monthly installments until its total cost was settled, but it wasn't a true mortgage, and Ross did not get equity as he paid. In the event that he to payment, Ross would have to forfeit at one point. Meanwhile, the government was actively subsidizing the creation of the white middle class. FHA loans, the GI Bill, the massive federal highway system, each of these made the idea of suburbia and homeownership possible. New suburbs often explicitly barred Blacks from renting or buying. And since the presence of Black neighbors would dent a community's ratings in the real estate market, whites actively, sometimes violently, resisted the integration of their neighborhoods. And so it was that during one of the biggest economic expansions in American history, African Americans were relegated to neighborhoods where they could not buy homes or build wealth, and where economic investment was punished. America was going boom while Black folks were being forced to go bust. Today, Black folks up and down the income scale are much more likely to live in segregated areas with concentrated poverty. The average white family has 20 times the household wealth of the average African American family. It is not hyperbole to suggest that almost any racial disparity you might name, standardized test scores and unemployment rates and health outcomes and incarceration figures, is just 2 or 3 steps removed from housing discrimination. Coates argues in favor of H.R. 40, a bill from Representative John Conyers, Democrat, Michigan, has introduced at the beginning of each session of Congress. The bill calls for a congressional study of slavery and its lingering effects, as well as recommendations for appropriate remedies. That bill has never made it to the House floor. Coates argues in favor of H.R. 40, a bill that, what's surprising and effective about the piece is how new this history feels in Coates' hands. Full disclosure, I'm friends with Coates and saw a final version of it shortly before it was published. He vividly connects the plunder of Ross's family wealth in Mississippi to the different but equally thorough plunder he experienced in the North. It's odd then to see indictments of a putative African-American unwillingness to work next to a long history that shows the products of Black people's labor being taken from them. Coates reminds us that even as welfare, a program often caricatured as a kind of wealth redistribution vehicle to poor Blacks, was tailored so that it exempted Blacks for its first several decades. The case for a reset. But it wouldn't be terribly hard to imagine another magazine piece written by someone else called The Case for a Reset. It would say, we need to look forward, not backward. If we must reckon with anything, it's that the reckoning we've been doing has not been effective. We should redouble our efforts and question our orthodoxies. We should stop so obsessively focusing on race and the role it plays in our history. You could see the yearning for that reset everywhere. Consider the recent survey of thousands of young people by NTV, in which an overwhelming majority felt that focusing on race prevented society from becoming colorblind. About the same number of respondents said that they were opposed to affirmative action, as they believe it's never fair to give preferential treatment to one race over another, regardless of historical inequalities. Indeed, the whole idea of righting historical inequalities has even been dropped by most proponents of affirmative action, in large part because of the Supreme Court's skepticism of the argument. The primary case for affirmative action is about the value of diversity, underscored most notably by former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's opinion in Gritter versus Bollinger. Quote, the court expects that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest approved today, she famously wrote. Despite centuries of codified discrimination, O'Connor could see a shiny post-racial future in the offing, a mere generation away. Some who want a reset, like the Daily Beast's John McWhirter, don't quibble with Coates' history, but take issue with his call for a reckoning. Quote, imagine, okay, the acknowledgement has been expressed. I accept it, and now finally we can move on. I just can't see it. More likely would be, they better not think they can just say sorry and be done with it. One imagines the tweets, 400 years and it's all over with a conversation, hashtag it's not over. Many would argue that this would be just the right thing, that America would remain on the hook for efforts aimed at Black uplift. And I'm all for uplift, but wonder what the atonement would add. In 100 years, who would look back and say that Black America would have been better off in the early 21st century if there had been a national reparational realization about race, unquote. The proponents of the reset, McWhirter, come in many different flavors. Roger Clegg of the Center for Economic Opportunity, a conservative think tank that focuses on issues like affirmative action and immigration, has argued against H.R. 40, Conyers' bill to examine the effects of slavery. Clegg suggested that the problems disproportionately affecting African Americans today are rooted not in discrimination but in personal behavior. Quote, no one will dispute that slavery and Jim Crow were horrible and inhumane. No one will dispute that discrimination still exists, though only a delusional person would deny that America has made radical, dramatic, inspiring progress in the last 40 years, that its society has truly been transformed in an astonishingly short period of time. But it is impossible to say how much of the present is the result of one particular kind of event in the past. Only someone very arrogant or foolish would make such a pronouncement. The principal hurdle facing the African American community today is the fact that 7 out of 10 African Americans are born out of wedlock. Just about any social problem you can name, crime, drugs, dropping out of school, doing poorly in school, and so forth, has a strong correlation with growing up in a home without a father, and it is very hard to argue that this problem is traceable to slavery or Jim Crow, since illegitimacy rates started to skyrocket in the African American community just at the time that Jim Crow was starting to crumble, unquote. There's a spectrum of feeling within this realm of thought, but the general idea is that the excavation of our history has been, and will be, of little benefit to our progress. On the issues of race, everyone in America deserves a fresh start. The unsatisfying reality. It's probably safe to say that America has opted for neither Coates' reckoning or the much yearned for reset. To the extent that we've tried to wrestle with our legacy of discrimination and the questions of redress, it's been piecemeal, politically unsustainable, and only partially effective. Yet the idea that we should endeavor to break free of our history has been continuously thwarted by the ways history keeps inconveniently imposing itself onto our present. In an especially intriguing section of Coates' essay, he explores a moment in which reparations for historical crime were paid out, and it still left everyone unsatisfied. As post-war Germany tried to rectify the damage it had wrought during the Holocaust, only a tiny fraction of West Germans said that they felt any guilt surrounding the atrocities. Less than a third felt that Jews should be compensated by Germans. But Jews weren't sanguine about the idea of reparations either. There was violence in the streets and bomb threats in anti-reparation factions storming the Knesset in protest. Survivors of the Holocaust feared laundering the reputation of Germany with money and mortgaging the memory of their dead. Beyond that, there was a taste for revenge. My soul would be at rest if I knew there were 6 million German dead to match the 6 million Jews, said Mayor Dworzecki, who'd survived the concentration camps of Estonia. Quote, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion countered the sentiment not by repudiating vengeance, but with cold calculation. If I could take German property without sitting down with them for even a minute to go in with jeeps and machine guns to the warehouses and take it, I would do that. If, for instance, we had the ability to send 100 divisions and tell them, take it, but we can't do that, unquote. The eventual resolution, West Germany paid the equivalent of $7 billion, bolstered the Israeli economy, and resulted in the creation of thousands of jobs. For the first time in the history of a people that has been persecuted, oppressed, plundered, and despoiled for hundreds of years in countries of Europe, persecutor and despoiler has been obliged to return part of his spoils and has even undertaken to make collective reparation as partial compensation for material losses, Ben-Gurion wrote of the agreement. That it was only partial compensation is important to remember in this conversation about reparations in America. It could only be that way. The forces that continually thwarted Clyde Ross came and come to bear on millions of other folks' lives in distinct, perverse ways. Given the scope of the history being considered and the scale of the ugliness it entails, one thing is certain, however this conversation unfolds. Whether with a reckoning, with a reset, or with a lack of resolution, just as in Israel, many of us are destined to be unsatisfied.
Just enter in your name and hit save.
Good morning, I'm Emerson Yearwood, and this morning I'll be reading from The History of Jazz by Ted Gioia. This ability of African performance arts to transform the European tradition of composition while assimilating some of its elements is perhaps the most striking and powerful evolutionary force in the history of modern musics. The genres of music that bear the marks of this influence are legion. Let's name a few: gospel, spirituals, soul, rap, minstrel songs, Broadway musicals, ragtime, jazz, blues, R&B, rock, samba, reggae, salsa, cumbia, calypso, even some contemporary operatic and symphonic music. The history of jazz is closely intertwined with many of these other hybrid genres, and tracing the various genealogies can prove dauntingly complex. For example, minstrel shows, which developed in decades before the Civil War, found white performers in blackface mimicking and most often ridiculing the music, dance, and culture of the slave population. Often, the writer of minstrel songs worked with little actual knowledge of Southern Black music. A surprising number of these composers hailed from the Northeast, and the most celebrated writer of minstrel inflected songs, Stephen Foster, created a powerful, romanticized image of Southern folk life, yet his experience with the South was restricted to a brief interlude spent in Kentucky and a single trip down the Mississippi to New Orleans. Later generations of Black entertainers, influenced by the popularity of these secondhand evocations of their own culture, imitated in turn the white stereotypes of African American behavior. Thus, in its impact on early jazz, minstrel music presents a rather convoluted situation. A Black imitation of a white caricature of Black music exerts its influence on another hybrid form of African and European music. The work song, another frequently cited predecessor to jazz, is more purely African in nature. So much so that some examples recorded in the southern United States early in this century seem to show almost no European or American influence. This ritualized vocalizing of Black American workers, with its proud disregard for Western systems of notation and scales, comes in many variants: field hollers, levee camp hollers, prison work songs, street cries, and the like. This entire category of singing has all but disappeared in our day, yet the few recordings extant reveal a powerful, evocative, and comparatively undiluted form of African music in the Americas. Generalizations about African music are tricky at best. Many commentators have treated the culture of West Africa as though it were a homogeneous and unified body of practices. In fact, many different cultures contribute to the traditions of West Africa. However, a few shared characteristics stand out amid this plurality in the study of African music, in any study of African music, with many of these same elements reappearing in somewhat different guise in jazz. For example, call and response forms that predominate in African music figure as well in the work song, the blues, jazz, and other Americanized strains of African music. Yet in its original African form, the call and response format is as much a matter of social integration as an issue of musical structure. It reflects a culture in which the fundamental Western separation of audience from performers is transcended. This brings us to a second unifying element of African musical traditions: the integration of performance into the social fabric. In this light, African music takes on an aura of functionality, one that defies any pure aesthetic attempting to separate art from social needs. Yet, since these functions are often tied to rituals and other liminal experiences, music never falls into the mundane type of functionality, background music in the dentist's office, accompaniment to a television commercial, and so on, that one sees increasingly in the West. Integrated into ritual occasions, music retains its otherworldliness for the African, its ability to transcend the here and now. The cross-fertilization between music and dance is a third unifying theme in the traditional African cultures, so deeply ingrained that scholar John Miller Chernoff remarks that for an African, quote, understanding, quote, a certain type of music means, in its most fundamental sense, knowing what dance it accompanies. A fourth predominant feature of African music is the use of instruments to emulate the human voice. This technique, which also plays a key role in jazz music, even extends to percussion instruments, most notably in the kalangu, the remarkable talking drum of West Africa. An emphasis on improvisation and spontaneity is a further shared trait of different African musical cultures, and these two have figured prominently in, and to some extent, have come to define the later jazz tradition. However, the most prominent characteristic, the core element of African music, is its extraordinary richness of rhythmic content. It is here one discovers the essence of the African musical heritage, as well as the key to unlocking the mystery of its tremendous influence on so many disparate schools of 20th century music. The first Western scholars who attempted to come to grips with this rhythmic vitality, whether in its African or Americanized form, struggled merely to find a vocabulary and notational method to encompass it. Henry Edward Crable, author of an early study of African American folk songs, conveys the frustration of these endeavors in describing the African musicians he encountered at the World's Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago in 1893. Quote, "The players showed the most remarkable rhythmical sense and skill that ever came under my notice. Berlioz, in his supremest effort with his army of drummers, produced nothing to compare in artistic interest with the harmonious drumming of these savages. The fundamental effect was a combination of double and triple time, the former kept by the singers, the latter by the drummers, but it is impossible to convey the idea of the wealth of detail achieved by the drummers by means of the exchange of the rhythms, syncopations of both simultaneously and dynamic devices." End of quote. Crable engaged the services of John C. Fillmore, an expert in Indian music, in an attempt to notate the playing of these musicians. But eventually they gave up in despair. Quote, "I was forced to the conclusion," Crable later recalled, in an account in which irritation and awe are present in equal doses, "that their command of the rhythmic element, which in the musical art of the ancient Greeks stood higher than either melody or harmony, the best composers of today were the veriest tyros compared with these black savages." End of quote. The language of certain Eskimo tribes, we are told, has dozens of words for snow. Where other cultures only see an undifferentiated substance, they perceive subtle differences and a plethora of significations. Similarly, for the African, virtually every object of day-to-day life could be a source of rhythm, an instrument of percussion, an inspiration for the dance. The tools and implements with which the African subdued often hostile surrounding environment may well have been the first sources of instrumental music on our planet. Here we perhaps come to realize the hidden truth of the double meaning of the word instrument, which signifies both a mechanism for subduing nature and a device for creating sound. We begin with the given: shells, flints, animal hides, trees, stones, sticks, and we end up with a dazzling array of instruments, both implements used in day-to-day life, weapons, tools, wheels, building devices, and in music making: drums, rattles, scrapers, gongs, clappers, friction instruments, percussion boards, and the like. But even earlier, the human body itself must have served as a rich source of musical sound. Despite the non-African conception of African music in terms of drums, historian John Storm Roberts points out, the African instruments most often used by the greatest number of people in the greatest variety of societies are the human voice and the human hands used for clapping. Both approaches to music, one that reached out and found it in the external world, the second that drew it from the physiological characteristics of the human form, came with the African to America. In the 1930s, researchers working for the Federal Writers Project undertook a comprehensive program of recording the memoirs of former slaves. This collection, housed today at the Archive of Folk Song at the Library of Congress, provides telling insight into this distinctive African American ability, strikingly similar to Native African practices, to extract music from the detritus of day-to-day life. There wasn't no music instruments, reads the Oral History of Former Slave Wash Wilson. Drums were fashioned out of a variety of discarded items. Quote, pieces of sheep's rib or cow's jaw or a piece of iron with an old kettle or a hollow gourd and some horse hairs. Sometimes they'd get a piece of trunk and hollow it out and stretch a goat's or sheepskins over it for the drum. They'd be 1 to 4 foot high and a foot up to 6 foot across. They'd take the buffalo horn and scrape it out to make the flute. That show'd be heard a long ways off. Then they'd take a mule's jawbone and rattle the stick across its teeth. They'd take a barrel and stretch an ox's hide across one end, and a man sat astride the barrel and beat on that hide with his hands and his feet. And if he got to feel the music in his bones, he beat on that barrel with his head. Another man beat on wooden sides with sticks. In African music, in both original and its various Americanized forms, different beats are frequently superimposed, creating powerful polyrhythms that are perhaps the most striking and moving element of African music. In the same way that Bach might intermingle different but interrelated melodies in creating a fugue, an African ensemble would construct layer upon layer of rhythmic patterns, forging a counterpoint of time signatures, a polyphony of percussion. We will encounter this multiplicity of rhythm again and again in our study of African American music, from the lilting syncopations of ragtime to the diverse offbeat accents of the bebop drummer to the jarring cross rhythms of the jazz avant-garde. Theorists of rhythm often dwell on its liberating and Dionysian element, but the history of rhythm as a source of social control and power has yet to be written. The historian Johann Huizinga hypothesized that the introduction of drums into the ranks of soldiers marked the end of the feudal age of chivalry and signaled the beginning of modern warfare, with its coordinated regiments and precise military discipline. Perhaps the subdued and steady rhythms of modern office music, and is not Muzak the work song for our own age, serve today to exert a subtle control over the white-collar worker of post-industrialized society. In any event, both aspects of rhythm, on the one hand as a source of liberation and on the other as a force of discipline and control, make their presence felt in African-American music. The work song was the melody of disciplined labor, and even here its source could be traced back to Africa. The African tradition, like the European peasant tradition, stressed hard work and derided laziness in any form, writes historian Eugene D. Genovese in his seminal study of slave society, Roll, Jordan, Roll. The celebration of labor inherent in the African-American work song must otherwise seem strangely out of place, coming from an oppressed race consigned to the indignities of slavery. But as soon as one sees the song of work as part of an inherently African approach to day-to-day life, one that integrates music into the occupations of here and now, this paradox disappears entirely. If the work song reflects rhythm as a source of discipline, the blues represents the other side of African rhythms, the Dionysian side that offered release. More than any of the other forms of early African-American music, the blues allowed the performer to present an individual statement of pain, oppression, poverty, longing, and desire. Yet it achieved all this without falling into self-pity and recriminations. Instead, the idiom offered a catharsis, an idealization of the individual's plight, and in some strange way, an uplifting sense of mastery over the melancholy circumstances recounted in the context of the blues song. In this regard, the blues offers us a psychological enigma as profound as any posed by classical tragedy. How art finds fulfillment for both artist and audience by dwelling on the oppressive and the tragic has been an issue for speculation at least since the time of Aristotle. Simply substitute the word blues for tragedy in most of these discussions, and we find ourselves addressing the same questions, only now in the context of African American music. Next section is country blues and classical blues. The early accounts of slave music are strangely silent about the blues. But should this be any cause of surprise, especially when one considers the use of this idiom to articulate personal statements against oppression and injustice? Although the blues dates back to the 19th century, our best sense of what the earliest blues songs sounded like comes primarily from country blues recordings made in the 1920s and after. Many historians of African American music have invested much effort into finding even more primitive roots to the blues, into unlocking the hidden, underwritten, unrecorded history of this fascinating music. Some, such as Samuel Charters, have even journeyed to West Africa in an attempt to discover surviving traces of pre-slave origins of this music. The theories of such researchers, discussed in more detail below, are compelling as quasi-mythic interpretations of the origin of the blues. Yet in presenting an actual lineage of influence, they remain speculative at best. Given our deep ignorance of the true birth of the blues, we perhaps do best by focusing on the comparatively modern recordings by musicians such as Robert Johnson, Blind Lemon Jefferson, Charlie Patton, Son House, and Leadbelly, among others. The term blues is often used to refer to any sad or mournful song. As such, it is one of the most frequently misused terms in music. For a contemporary musician, the term blues refers to a precise 12-bar form that relies heavily on tonic, dominant, and subdominant harmonies. The blues are further characterized by the prevalence of blue notes, often described as the use in the earliest blues of both the major and minor third in the vocal line, with the flattened seventh, the flattened fifth. The flattened fifth, most accounts indicate, later became equally prominent as a blue note. In fact, this stock description is also somewhat misleading. In country blues, the major and minor thirds were not used interchangeably. Instead, the musician might often employ a bent note that would slide between these two tonal centers, or create a tension by emphasizing the minor third in the context in which the harmony implied a major tone. Much speculation has been offered as to the historical origin of this powerful and unique melodic device. Some commentators, for example, have suggested that this technique originated when the newly arrived slaves tried to reconcile an African pentatonic scale with the Western diatonic scale, with the result being two areas of tonal ambiguity around the third and seventh intervals that evolve into the modern blue notes. In any event, this effect, which is impossible to notate, is one of the most gut-wrenching sounds in 20th century music. Given its visceral impact, it is little cause for surprise that the device soon spread beyond the blues idiom into jazz and many other forms of popular music. When sung, it usually was in its earliest form. The blues employs a specific stanza form for its lyrics, in which an initial line is stated, then repeated, and then followed by a rhyming line. For example, Robert Johnson sings in his blues, "Drunken-Hearted Man," "My father died and left me. My poor mother done the best that she could. My father died and left me. My poor mother done the best that she could. Every man likes that game you call love, but it don't mean no man no good." The form is capable not only of heartfelt lament, but also poetic subtlety, as in the expressive opening chorus sung by blues singer Sippy Wallace in Morning Dove Blues in her 1925 collaboration with New Orleans cornetist King Oliver. Early in the morning, I rise like a morning dove. Early in the morning, I rise like a morning dove, moaning and singing about the man I love. In later years, this form would become known as the 12-bar blues, which each of the 3 lyrics taking up 4 bars. But with the earliest country blues singers, the metrics were approximate at best. In a Robert Johnson or Blind Lemon Jefferson performance, a blues stanza might take 12 bars, 12 and a half bars, 13 bars, even 15 bars or more. To a musician raised in the European/Western tradition, such liberties with the length of a song form are almost unthinkable. They violate the ingrained assumption that a song must have a predetermined length and that this length must be the same every time the song is played. But these early blues artists came from a different tradition, building from work songs and other call and response forms that had an organic structure, one that no more followed a pattern of perfect songbird. Indeed, musicians coming from such traditions often have trouble playing with others, and numerous early country blues musicians were accused of not being able to keep time when they played in group settings. But these criticisms missed the essence of this music, which did not require elaborate band arrangements. Accompanying themselves on guitar, players such as Johnson or Leadbelly could add or subtract beats without worrying about whether other musicians would follow them. A tight ensemble sound was not central to their music. Instead, they focused on creating a powerful music of personal expression, one in which the individualized metrics became akin to the natural pauses employed in breathing and speaking. Robert Johnson remains the best known of the Mississippi Delta blues singers, so much so that a 1990 reissue of his recordings became an international bestseller and achieved surprising crossover sales to fans of rock and heavy metal music. Such fame contrasts with the semi-obscurity of Johnson's music during his lifetime. Born on May 8, 1911 in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, Johnson left behind only a few dozen recordings, all of them set down in a Texas hotel during November 1936 and June 1937. Only one of these, Terraplane Blues, achieved significant sales during Johnson's lifetime. After his death on August 16, 1938, Johnson's impact grew with the passing years, and other performances of his, such as Love in Vain and Hellhound on My Trail, have achieved a widespread influence far beyond the confines of jazz and blues. The themes of his lyrics, unrequited love, traveling, the vagaries of fate, have a timeless quality. His richly rhythmic guitar work remains an inspirational model of blues playing. The authenticity of his singing is unsurpassed. Johnson, despite his accepted position as the paragon of the Delta blues, is actually a fairly late example of this musical tradition. The recordings of Charlie Patton sent an earlier, less urbanized stream in the Delta blues tradition. Patton, who was born in Hinds County, Mississippi, probably in April 1891, was 20 years older than Johnson. Although his recordings date from his late 1920s until his death in 1934, Patton actually began his performing career over 2 decades earlier, at a time when he retained close ties to plantation life. Patton achieved a fair degree of notoriety in the Mississippi Delta and came to exert a strong influence on a number of other Delta blues players, such as Willie Brown, Tommy Johnson, and Son House, a musical partner of Patton's, who later served as a teacher and a mentor to Robert Johnson. The two cornerstones of Patton's music were his subtly propulsive guitar style and his rich and relaxed singing, in which melodic phrases were often intermingled with spoken asides. He combined these two elements in a pointed counterpoint of vocal and instrumental music. The effect was that of an artful conversation between the man and his guitar, a dialogue that harkened back to the pervasive African call and response tradition. Patton played often in juke joints and various social settings, and one can easily envision his one-man band serving as dance music. The range of his recordings is striking, stretching from the pungent vocal and guitar interaction on his medium-tempo classic, Pony Blues, to the upbeat syncopations of Shake It and Break It, or the religious fervor of his Prayer of Death. The turn of the century country blues tradition was not restricted to the Mississippi Delta. Blind Lemon Jefferson, who was born near Wortham, Texas in 1897, also developed a powerful rural blues style. Jefferson employed a spare, riff-oriented guitar style behind his droning and resonant vocalizing. Although he was capable of the raspy low tones favored by many blues singers, his voice was perhaps most admired for its thin, high tones, a stylistic device that for many listeners stands out as the most distinctive characteristic of the early Texas blues sound. Jefferson's first records date from the mid-1920s and, like Patton's, include both religious music as well as the blues work that would generate renown for him around the South. Jefferson appears to have traveled and performed widely, although it's often difficult to separate the truth from rumor in the case of this now legendary bluesman, before his death in December 1929. That's right.
Okay. Let's see here. I need some assistance.
What's that?
I think I closed where I'm supposed to put my name.
Yeah, okay, so there should be 3 little dots here, right here, where you can edit,
Okay.
okay? And it says edit name,
Right.
there you go.
Okay. Here we go. Good. Okay. Just hit save. Okay. Hello, my name is Michael Reardon, and I'm going to be reading from Trying to Find an Identity, Eric Clapton's Changing Conception of Blackness, which is from a book called Black, White, and Blue, Racial Politics of Blues Music in the 1960s. And this is chapter 2. It's written by Ulrich Aldet and starts with a quote by Frank Zappa from 1966, which Frank Zappa said, "You know, I'm not black, but there's a whole lot of times I wish I could say I'm not white." When the world-famous blues guitarist Eric Clapton stumbled on stage in Birmingham, England on August 5th, 1976, and announced his support for the anti-immigration campaign of British politician Enoch Powell, many of his fans were outraged. How could a white musician who had been making his living playing black music for more than a decade endorse racist politics? Hadn't Clapton always shown his utmost respect for and deep understanding of black music? And hadn't he just had a #1 hit with a cover of Bob Marley's I Shot the Sheriff? In this chapter, I look at Eric Clapton as an exemplary figure of the British blues movement of the 1960s and critically interrogate constructions of blackness and blues authenticity as they appeared in his interviews and in his music. Like other blues musicians from the 1960s, notably members of the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin, Clapton went on to become a major rock star. This personal transformation elucidates a major popular genre transformation from blues to rock, which for Clapton and others was linked to the hippie counterculture and translated into commercial success in the United States as well as Europe. By closely analyzing Eric Clapton's career in the 1960s in the context of the white Negro music, but I will also offer a counter-narrative to the histories of the 1960s, which tend to describe the decade as the temporary trumping of conservative forces by liberal forces. As I will show, the racial essentialism that informed Eric Clapton's support for a conservative politician was inextricably linked with the racial essentialism that informed his appreciation of black sounds. Although Clapton moved away from a racial essentialism when he played with the group Cream between 1966 and 1968, he would ultimately return to the purist perspective on race, which had characterized his earlier career and which had become the dominant narrative of blues music since the 1970s. White Negroes, the complex identification of white people with black sounds, has a long-standing tradition, as many scholars have traced in recent years. A key text to understanding white appropriations of blackness is Norman Mailer's glowing description of the white Negro, a term which had been introduced by Paul Verlaine to describe the fellow poet Arthur Rimbaud. In his 1957 essay, Mailer equates the appropriation of black culture, in particular jazz spontaneity, with being a hipster, a view also apparent in many writings of the 1950s beat generation like those of Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. A few years earlier, Frantz Fanon had vividly described what he had saw as the alienation of a black man in the face of white oppression. In an astonishing role reversal, Mailer envisioned black man as something real to aspire to in the face of white alienation in his essay. The White Negro drew mixed reactions after its publication. While James Baldwin criticized Mailer's sexual insecurity and romanticism, Eldridge Cleaver aligned Mailer's hedonistic fantasies of primitivized masculinity with his own and connected the White Negro to student protests at the University of California at Berkeley. Recently, Manuel Luis Martinez has uncovered reactionary, imperialistic, misogynist, and racist tendencies in the writings of Beat Generations. What Martinez calls self-marginalization gained through appropriation of ethnic identity appears not only in Mailer's White Negro, but also in Allen Ginsberg's Jazz Slumming on Negro Streets, and famously in the following passage from Jack Kerouac's On the Road. And this is the passage. At lilac evening, I walked with every muscle aching among the lights of 27th and Welton in the Denver colored section, wishing I were a Negro, feeling that the true best the white world had offered was not enough ecstasy for me, not enough life, joy, kicks, darkness, music, not enough night. I wished I were a Denver Mexican or even a poor overworked Jap, anything but I was so drearily, a white man disillusioned. I was only myself, Sal Paradise, sad, strolling in this violent dark, this unbearably sweet night, wishing I could exchange worlds with the happy, true-hearted, ecstatic Negroes of America. Cleaver was not alone in attempting to bridge the gap between the white counterculture and black politics as the formation of John Sinclair's White Panther Party and their rejection of white honky culture and the appropriation of the Black Panthers' masculinist discourse shows. Martinez does not stop there, however. He finds a continuation of the beat's neo-romantic and reactionary tendencies in the 1960s countercultural writings of Hunter S. Thompson, Ken Kesey. Martinez's approach of countering the countercultural paves the way for a more complex discussion of the racial politics of seemingly progressive artistic movements of the 1960s. To a certain degree, my assessment of Eric Clapton follows Martinez's indictment of the racial narratives of the beats. As I will show, like Sal Paradise and Kerouac's narrative, Clapton felt it legitimate to identify as a white Negro and take everything but burden from black culture. The British blues movement, when Eric Clapton started to play the London club circuit in 1963, as he was stepping into a burgeoning R&B scene that had grown out of an earlier established jazz scene. During World War II, a swing craze had swept through Europe, including a strong demand for boogie-woogie piano, which can be closely linked to blues music. In the 1950s, jazz clubs in London's West End served as both trad jazz in the tradition of the 1920s New Orleans styles, as well as modern jazz aficionados preferred bebop of the 1940s and called trad jazz fans moldy figs, despite the fact that they were equally purist in their tastes. Memorable British band leaders included Humphrey Lyttelton, Ken Coyler, and Chris Barber. One of Barber's singers, Lonnie Donegan, helped to establish a distinctly British musical genre called skiffle that became a major movement in 1956 and 1957 after Donegan had sold more than 1 million copies of the Leadbelly classic, Rock Island Line, worldwide. Skiffle was a simple acoustic music that invited amateurs to participate and consisted mainly of angelicized versions of American spirituals, gospel, bluegrass, and pop tunes. Standard instruments were acoustic guitar, string bass, washboard, and kazoo. Two other sidemen of Chris Barber, Chris Corner and Cyril Davies, opened the London Blues and Barrel House Club in 1957, but it took another 5 years until the British blues movement made an impact. In the meantime, many major American blues performers had played in Britain, often with British backup bands. Electric guitar playing was still considered inauthentic by the moldy figs, which caused many people to boo Muddy Waters and Otis Spann at the Leeds Folk Festival in 1958, preceding Bob Dylan's tumultuous Going Electric at the Newport Folk Festival by 7 years. When Waters returned in 1962 with an acoustic lineup to accommodate his audience, the British blues movement was already in full swing, and the fans once again disappointed, this time because Waters was not plugging in. Overall, however, the British market proved to be viable. Many American blues artists appeared on BBC's Jazz Club program. Lightnin' Hopkins recorded an album called The Rooster Crowed in England in 1961, which included the songs Hello England and Blues for Queen Elizabeth. In addition to new recordings, British blues enthusiasts were able to assess American blues on reissues. One notable example are Robert Johnson's King of the Delta Blues Singers LP on Columbia from 1961 and 1966, and the Radio American 40s Network, Radio Luxembourg. And a few even traveled to the U.S. for research and recording trips, among them Paul Oliver, Albert McCarthy, and Sam Charters. In 1962, Alex Corner and Cyril Davies formed Blues Incorporated, the first resident band at the Marquee Club and the starting ground for musicians that would later join the seminal rock groups Cream, among them Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, and the Rolling Stones, with Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Brian Jones, Charlie Watts, and Ron Wood. The Rolling Stones, named after a Muddy Waters song, were formed in the same year and became the resident band at the Crawdaddy Club in the West London suburb Richmond in 1963. 1 year later, their version of Willie Dixon's Little Red Rooster was a #1 hit in the UK. The younger British bands like the Stones, the Pretty Things, and the Yardbirds had begun to attract larger audiences, were equally influenced by the electric Chicago blues of Muddy Waters and John Lee Hooker. In the 1950s, rock and roll by Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Bo Diddley, and highlighted electric guitar and harmonica playing. Unlike pop groups like the Beatles, less emphasis was given to original compositions and a credible vocal performance, leading Muddy Waters to comment in the 1970s, "They got all these white kids now. Some of them can play good blues. They play so much, run a ring around you playing guitar, but they cannot sing a vocal like the black man." What is important to note here is that the British blues bands of the 1960s were latching on to black music from America, eventually returning the music to the US. However, black music from the Caribbean, readily available in Britain at the time because of waves of immigration from the West Indies, was not an influence until Bob Marley's Catch a Fire album in 1973 and Eric Clapton's #1 hit with Marley's I Shot the Sheriff 1 year later. This might be even more surprising considering that the Flamingo Club, where many British R&B groups played, attracted Caribbean immigrants and featured ska and rock steady, and considering that Chris Blackwell moved from Island Records from Jamaica to London in 1962. Pete Townsend, whose group The Who started recording in 1964, the same year Eric Clapton released his first records with the Yardbirds, explains that Caribbeans were too close to influence very deeply, and that they had a self-contained lifestyle. They were good people, suspicious of young whites who saw something special in simply being black. Townsend describes how he was fascinated by James Brown and Bo Diddley because they transported romantic notions of a mythic America. America was still a distant and evocative idea to us, full of mystique. Remember, we were all war babies, bought up on free chewing gum handed out by clean-cut, grinning GIs. The emphasis of nation over race is deceptive, though. After all, both Townsend and Clapton were exclusively seeking out black sounds and creating an authentic other. This is revealed in a passage by Eric Clapton in which he equates America with racial marginalization. The first books I ever bought were about America. The first records were American. I was just devoted to the American way of life without having been there. I was ready for it all. I wanted to learn about Red Indians and the blues and everything. I really was an American fan. Clapton's admiration of America is closely linked with an imagined otherness, which is why blues and Red Indians offer similar colonial fantasies. These fantasies were not compatible with the post-colonial reality of the Caribbean immigrants who quite possibly even frequented the same clubs. The British blues movement provided an environment in which Eric Clapton was able to flourish until he eventually became one of the best-known rock instrumentalists of all time. Clapton started out as a blues purist, and after engaging in more fluid racial, if not gender categories in the latter half of the 1960s, returned to a racially existentialist and masculine concept of blues in the 1970s. This development illustrates the solidification of a 1960s that rested on essentialist notions of race in which Eric Clapton ultimately was not able to escape. And that concludes chapter 2.
And do the edit name and put your name in there. Okay. A bit louder.
My name is Ruben Aguilar, and the piece I will be reading is titled Pope Nicholas V and the Portuguese Slave Trade. With Portugal's expansion into Western Africa in the 15th century, Iberian merchants began to recognize the importance of a large-scale slave trafficking enterprise. One of the first to record this sentiment, according to Portuguese royal chronicler Gomes Anes de Zurara, was a young ship captain named Anton Gonçalves, who sailed to West Africa in 1441, hoping to acquire seal skins and oil. After obtaining his cargo, Gonçalves called a meeting of the 21 sailors who accompanied him and unveiled his plan to increase their profits. According to Zurara, Gonçalves told his crew, quote, "We have already got our cargo, but how fair a thing it would be if we, who have come to this land for a cargo of such petty merchandise, were to trade, it may also be viewed as an extension of an older tradition of raiding and ransom on both shores of the Mediterranean. Upon returning to Portugal, Gonçalves treated his captives in accordance with a